Well, Jane, how amazing to get you on the podcast. I'm so delighted that we're able to share this conversation. And just for, the listeners, we met not that long ago when a mutual friend invited us both for lunch. And of course, we'd never met each other before. And, when I heard you were a doctor in the NHS, part of me had a certain amount of cynicism, ahead of meeting you. And part of me was incredibly interested in what you might have to say or share. And then I met you and we were sitting there having lunch with our respective partners and you blew me away. You spoke, you were able to put words to something that I think we all know at some level about systems and organisations and resources and well-being and how do you manage all of that? What's the organisation's responsibility? What's our personal responsibility? What's our responsibility to our colleagues? And you spoke and it was like music. And so I'm really, this is something that I really want people to hear, especially because the NHS comes up with such a lot of criticism. So maybe first of all, you could just introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about how you came to think the way you think.
Well, Maria, thank you first up for your very kind words. And it was amazing to have that interaction with you, which I seem to remember was actually quite brief because you were rushing for a train, and we managed to cram a lot of conversation into about 45 minutes whilst eating a meal. But thanks for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And just to talk a little bit about myself, I trained as a medical doctor and actually had a very important for me in my life's journey experience of taking it on as a sense of vocation. So I had a short illness when I was 16, grew up in Guernsey in the Channel Islands, and the small hospital there couldn't fix it. And I was transferred to a London hospital for some surgery. And it was while I was in a hospital bed in the Royal London Hospital with two big tubes coming out of my side that I had this notion I should become a doctor. I'd never had it before. I was doing all the wrong A-levels. And long story short, I found my way into medical school and I found that sense of vocation really sustaining when I was doing long hours and it was all very arduous. And I have to say, I loved my years as a young doctor. I enjoyed being part of a hospital. I enjoyed the work with the patients and felt it was a real privilege to work with patients. I quickly elected the specialty of haematology, particularly malignant haematology, so that's cancers of the blood. I was attracted because at that time there was a lot of improved understanding of cancer, and that was academically very interesting. But also patients experiencing that really challenging time of life, often young patients having prolonged courses of chemotherapy and journeying with them through that, I found to be a privilege and something that I wanted to do well. As I progressed in my clinical career, I became more interested in what I now call the ecosystem of the hospital. So the way the hospital was set up, how the cupboards were full of the stuff we needed, and there was lots of very smart, well-trained people delivering amazing care, but in this very complex system. And I think as I was interested in that ecosystem of how the hospital worked, I was perhaps spotted as a promising clinical leader. And I went up a leadership hierarchy in the hospital quite quickly as quite a young consultant. And I held with me from the beginning the thought that if we are able to take care of our staff, they will then take care of patients. I don't think for a moment it was an original thought. Richard Branson was saying it. If he took care of his staff, they'd take care of his passengers on the planes. But it was something that was really important to me. And I found as I got on in my leadership career and progressed up a hierarchy, it got harder and harder to do that. I elected to do an MBA course, a Master's in Business Administration. I thought it would make me a better leader. Perhaps it did, perhaps it didn't. But by that time, I was increasingly frustrated and I will say distressed about the situation in which I found myself, wanting to give great care to patients, take great care of staff, but finding, I remember thinking I was walking through treacle a lot, and it was really, really difficult. And a couple of things happened. I was in an NHS trust, which was in special measures, which is kind of like the naughty step for NHS organisations. And when that happens, there's often a throughput of senior leaders because they have historically been judged to have failed and been shuffled off, and you get a new team in that think they can sort everything out, and they often end up in the same predicament. So by 2016, I'd been a consultant for probably about 10 years. I realised that I had just had enough. I was really exhausted, really fed up, increasingly distressed, and felt that the demands being made on me, often by people external to the hospital, so in those days they were called the commissioners, were not just difficult, but kind of unreasonable in some sort of way. Anyway, long story short, rather dramatically, after a couple of things happened that I felt were grossly unfair, I decided to resign. And I didn't just resign my leadership role, I resigned my license to practice. I kind of said, I'm done. I've had enough. As I tell the story now, sometimes I just frame it as I left in a monumental huff. And I think I really was in a huff about the way things were, but I was also incredibly tired and wanted to have a think about things, think about what was going on, that a system of healthcare had taken a really passionate doctor and, as I felt, chewed up and spat out by that system. What's that about? And I was really fortunate, I suppose, to have the opportunity to embark on a doctoral program. I'd done my master's study. Next thing is a doctorate. And I started doing a doctorate in organizational change. It was a method of research called action research. And as I frame that, it's like living your life through a doctoral lens. So as Kierkegaard, the philosopher, said, we live our lives forward. That's all we can do, but we have to understand them and make sense of it backwards, as it were. And so I spent a lot of time interrogating my previous experience. I've always journaled, so I had years, decades actually, of journals to go back and review what I was thinking, what I was feeling, what I was experiencing, and try and work with that to think, okay, if you could begin to think differently about healthcare provision, how would you think about it? What would you do? And so that was really when my deeper thinking about systems of healthcare, and by default, really, the way we are in society, I started to think more deeply about that.
When we run businesses, we know that there are going to be unpredictable disruptions and threats and challenges to running any business. And what do we do in the face of those challenges and disruptions? Do we ignore, do we avoid, or do we sort of just run away from it? In my time working with businesses and senior leadership teams, what I've discovered is actually the biggest threat to progress and growth and development is often the internal conflict and the internal tensions and the poor communication between team members or even in the boardroom. Internal conflict on its own is harmful enough. And when you combine that with external threats and pressures, it becomes a real existential threat to a business. So once a year, I open up an annual dialogue roadmap training specifically to help people in leadership positions develop the skills of conflict resolution, dialogue, compassionate communication in order to be able to handle these kinds of disruptions with elegance, with grace and with precision. Anybody in a line management or leadership position needs these skills as second nature, as something that you develop and that you can walk into any situation and know exactly what to say, how to handle it, and be a safe container for all the people around you that are relying on you or depending on you. So if you want to know more about this training, and it's only once a year and it is limited, click the link on the show notes below the episode if you're listening on audio, and if you're watching this on video, just click on the link below in the episode description. And I look forward to hearing from you, and I'd be more than happy to open a conversation if you think this might be for you. Thank you.
Quite a journey. And there were 2 or 3 sort of moments where, I mean, the first one was when you talked about, even Richard Branson said we have to take care of the people and then they'll take care of the patients, the customers, the service users.
Yeah.
And then the reality of there not being the resources to do that, and how difficult it becomes, and you finding that as you sort of go further up the food chain, it becomes harder and harder to do.
Absolutely, it does.
Because there are probably conversations and pressures and plans and strategies that you can't involve everybody in all the time.
Yeah.
So I really got that. And then when you said I left in a monumental huff, and of course what that triggered in me is a number of times I've done that, I've done things in a huff.
Yeah.
And how an organisation can take somebody who's got so much to give and chew them up and spit them out.
Yeah, right.
And you're not the first person to talk about this, and in fact it feels like something I could do a whole series on, where that's happened. But your amazing ability to kind of bounce back and say, okay, well, I'm not going to go and sort of paint on the top of a mountain in Tibet. I'm going to actually come at this through a different doorway. I think that would be fair to say, that you've come at this through a completely different doorway.
Yeah, and as I was studying for my doctorate, a couple of things happened which I think it's worth mentioning. And just to mention before, what I'm going to say next is quite distressing, actually. But I was invited into a trust where I hadn't worked. They knew of me, and they knew that I was doing study in staff wellbeing, for want of a better way of mentioning it. And they invited me to meet with the medical director and the chief exec of the hospital. And the situation was that a senior doctor in the organisation had taken his own life by suicide. And they wanted to understand if they had failed. Mm-hmm. They had failed to notice something, they had done something, an act of commission or omission that had in any way contributed to this deep tragedy. And in doing that piece of investigative work, really, I had the opportunity to talk to about 25 members of staff who were close to this doctor, and also to the family of the doctor. And it was a very salutary experience for me, because I realised that I'd been on my journey and this doctor had been on his journey. And we had both experienced an internalization of the stress of the system. And that had been profoundly difficult for both of us. And so I, as I put it, huffed off, but was able to draw myself into myself in a human way, and try and find some healing from that experience. So it was a profoundly informative process to my thinking, and it sort of stirred something in me that if I could ever humanly prevent someone else from getting into that situation and not seeing another way out, then that was what I wanted to do. I was figuring out how that might look and what I might do outside of the NHS, because I was still not working in the NHS. And I remember thinking maybe I could think about continuing to research that as part of my doctoral program. And speaking to the medical director who'd commissioned this piece of work a few months after I'd completed it and I'd made my recommendations, and he had this kind of faraway look in his eye, and he was looking at China and a virus that was coming out of China in about February 2020. And I realized he was more concentrated on that than he was on my recommendations and plans, and rightly so. But when the pandemic hit us, like the tsunami that it did in March 2020, he said, look, will you come and help us? And I was, of course I will. I can't sit on my hands. I'm a doctor. This is a pandemic. What would you like me to do? And he said, well, actually, could you help us support our staff as we face this pandemic and as we begin to think about it together? And so whilst I worked on some of the medical aspects of the pandemic, I also thought about how we could support staff. And actually, it was a very simple intervention. I got myself an office. Getting an office in the NHS these days is near on impossible, but I got myself an office because there was lots of empty ones. I opened the door and I invited people to come and talk to me. And it was remarkable, really. I stopped counting after I think I got to 156 people came to see me just to talk. And I stopped counting after that because it didn't feel important anymore. And just listening to staff and their experiences. And what was so interesting is that even in the middle of the pandemic, they were talking about something that might have happened 5 or 10 years hence that had been so difficult that actually the emotional surfacing of all the things that happened during the pandemic brought these things back to the surface as well. And so although they came in to talk about what life was like on the wards, they were often reminiscing and reflecting on other periods of time that had been really difficult in their healthcare, in their professional lives. And so it really informed my thinking, and I landed on an idea that we had neglected something very, very important in healthcare. And at first I was really struggling to know how to frame that. And I read some work by the Marxist philosopher Gillian Rose, and she was talking about grief and mourning. And she described it as work of the soul. And I thought, yes, that's it.
Yes.
That's it. We have neglected to do our necessary work of the soul. And what felt really important in finding those words is that you can't put a metric on a soul. It is by nature ineffable. As soon as you start talking about soul and soulfulness, you kind of betray it because you can't put words to it. But not to talk about it is also to betray it. So we have to find a language about the stuff that is deep within us and is deeply important to us, but difficult to articulate. And my final title was The Necessary and Neglected Work of the Soul. This is my thesis title, but it had a subtitle, Finding the Words When None Will Do. And it's kind of like we have to try and find the words, even though they're inadequate. But we have to talk about the deeper practice of care, of healing, of being with people. So that was where my thinking got to with my doctoral work. Since then, I've actually taken it a bit further, and I have in my mind, yes, there is the work that we must do on ourselves, by ourselves, and in relationship with others, that is soulful work. But we must also build community and think about how we show up with one another and how we choose to be when we're around other people. So there's the self bit, there's the community bit, and then, of course, there's the system bit.
Yeah, this is quite a journey that you're talking about, and it touches me really deeply, because you're starting to name the things that almost can't be named in organisations. And, in my experience, when I hear you say something like the work of the soul, and, that you can't put metrics to it, what I experience are barriers because you can't put metrics to it, because it can't be scientifically measured. And then actually, for me, it's very sad that the people that understand this, like Indigenous people, and, none of this is new. It's all stuff that's been lost. What I've found really difficult, and I'd love you to comment on, is that the academia, the science, as we understand it in mainstream, won't allow the space for this unless we can call it, quantum physics or something. What happens to you when you hear me say that?
I don't understand quantum physics at all, so I couldn't possibly comment. But your idea about this isn't new, this is ancient wisdom, and is such an important part of our humanity and what it means to be human. And part of me thinks that smartphones are responsible for a lot of wrong in the world. Certainly we're distracted by them and we can be nasty via them without the same consequences. But I think it probably was ever thus. It's a road less travelled, and all through the centuries, people have had a choice whether to take the road less travelled. And that's true in 2025 as it ever was, probably, possibly. I don't know. We can only interpret our experience in the light of our experience. And it's certainly been really important to me to take a pause, be it a prolonged pause for a few years outside the mainstream of my professional life, but to take that pause and stop and think quite deeply. There was an image I got halfway through my doctorate, because it was in organisational change, and for much of it I was outside an organisation. And they said, Jane, all very well, but how does a Buddha sitting under a tree change the world? And towards an answer, and I wasn't trying to be a smart aleck, but I was changed. Yes. And in me being changed, then...
And you are on the planet, and you exist, yes. And you're real, and you matter.
Absolutely. So, and I think it was Gandhi who said, be the change you want to see in the world.
Yeah. So, and you are, the organisational change starts with us, because I am an organisation. I'm a community of cells, or, whatever it is. I'm DNA. I'm also, there's a whole community collaborating with each other. So be the change means start here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And then I suppose where that takes me is, yes, that's great. And, without putting too fine a point on it, however you managed it, you had the luxury of doing that, which, of course, for people who are earning minimum wage or, struggling to live at the moment, maybe they don't have the luxury of taking these pauses. Sure. So then isn't it incumbent on the organisations that benefit from their service to provide those spaces, to provide that opportunity? I mean, where do you sit with that? And then I really would love you to talk about the things that you've actually brought in. But where does that sit with the response? Who's got the responsibilities?
Absolutely. So I totally think it is incumbent on us as now back in the NHS as a leader to think about people's day-to-day experience and where they get that moment of pause in their day or in their life more generally, and and inviting them to notice that in their own lives. So it may be the simple act of hugging your child or greeting your lovely dog. I've got one not too far away. We're blessed in England, even in the big cities, with beautiful parks and trees. And in nature, I think there's a great deal of solace and beauty. And again, perhaps it's not everybody's opportunity to live in gorgeous countryside. But there are still opportunities. We can all look at the sky and the clouds.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that even with the work I do in prisons, one of our prisoner trained facilitators was able, in Dartmoor prison, he took it upon himself. He found a small space that was hardly used. And I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, they kept the ferrets out there, and the ferrets were to catch the rats. But, you know, let's not go down that route.
Right.
But what he did, he found one small space and he went around the prison and he just collected anything at all that could make this place into a little sanctuary. And
Right.
bit by bit, stone by stone, he built this tiny little sanctuary and then wrote to the governor and said, I'd love you to come and see what I've built in this space.
Yeah.
And could we, if a prisoner gets bad news, like the death of a loved one, could they come and sit with me out here for 20 minutes?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, so these things, it's kind of almost impossible that someone could create that in the jail, and yet somebody did, and it was a prisoner.
Amazing.
So we can do this, can't we? And I think what that leads me on to is, you know, don't we have to look after each other? Because when I think about the NHS and, you know, going for treatment and talking to doctors, I wonder whether the mainstream population, you know, we've all been trained in consumerism and we've all been trained to expect a service. And, you know, in fact, in some places we call humans consumers, which I really object to. And, you know, whether there's something about educating patients that we're all in this to try and find healing one way or another. And I know for me, a story that really crops up is when my mum was coming towards end of life and we were in and out of A&E. And sometimes we'd be sat there for hours waiting for an ambulance to come. And I remember using my own work on myself, if you like, to transform the frustration of sitting there for hours and to look at this staff team who there's just no way in any level of imagination they could produce what they needed to produce with the amount of stuff that was coming in and at them every moment of the day. And I remember I was going to go and say, look, how long do you think an ambulance is going to take? Because we've been sitting here for hours. And instead what came out of my mouth was, I wonder when you trained and you imagined looking after people and their health, I wonder, but you didn't imagine what it would be like to not have the resources at your fingertips to do the job. And it was just a moment of work of the soul. So I just wonder about each looking after each other. And what you've brought and the things that you've brought, because you've actually taken actions.
Yeah. I mean, there is in many places a tremendous camaraderie between colleagues. I guess it could be termed spirit of the Blitz in a kind of old-fashioned English way. but I think it is the shared humanity. And that can be really incredible and humbling to see when a team is working well and cohesively for the benefit of the patients and their loved ones and their carers. And that's so beautiful and so humbling to see. Obviously, it's not all roses in the NHS at the moment, and yet there are still a vast number of people who take a great deal of pride and want to do the very best in the circumstances. I think there was a focus during the pandemic, inevitably, on the well-being of staff, which has slipped away. The phrase, they've gone from clapping to slapping, has been heard in many NHS trusts recently. One of the practical things that we did actually came out of the pandemic, and I just had a very serendipitous origin. I was invited to hear a Harvard professor of medicine speak in a North London GP event that was held in a garden at the end of the pandemic. And he was talking about slow medicine, and we might all slow down with our patients and take more time. And I was thinking, blimey, have you got any idea what it's like out there? And I was a bit cross, I think. And somebody came and tapped me on the shoulder at the end. I'd been quite energized when I was saying my piece. And she said, I heard what you said. And she said, I've got a retreat centre in the Darrant Valley. Okay, Kent. I'm in Kent. And we all piled down there during the pandemic and had a brilliant time. The weather was lovely. We were working on the land in the garden, but we knew there was a hospital 10 miles up the road where the experience was very different. And I was like, okay, this is weird because that's my hospital she's talking about where I spent the pandemic. And she said, we want to invite NHS staff down to the retreat centre as a thank you and as an opportunity. I was like, wow, that's amazing. And she'd been working with a number of colleagues to develop a sort of day retreat, going into the forest, doing forest bathing, which is a Japanese thing, being in the forest for therapeutic benefit. And I was introduced to a practice called sophrology, which I can talk about a little bit in a moment, if you like. But we took all the ITU staff down over 4 weeks. We did 4 retreats and about 30 people on each retreat. And then we took the emergency room staff, those that wanted to come. And a lot of people said, I don't want to come and hug a tree. And by the end of the evening, they were like, oh, this is just wonderful. We saw a shift with them over the day. So these were frontline staff that we were taking down into the countryside and seeing with some love and attention from the retreat team, being out in nature, a really nice, healthy, nutritious lunch where we talked about what healthy, nutritious food might be. It was amazing. And we saw some real shifts in people's understanding of what it means to care for oneself. Well, just through providing that experience and inviting them to think about what it means to care for yourself when we're so busy trying to care for other people. So that was amazing, that experience. More recently, we are really looking at nonviolent communication as a method of being with each other in the hospital, thinking about how we show up, how we might take a pause just in that moment between the impulse coming at us and wanting to react, but just, oh, let's pause and take a breath. And the practice I talked about, sophrology, can be helping us. It's tools and techniques to take that momentary breath, that pause. What's important here? What's really going on here? And then respond with emotions under some level of control, hopefully. So that's something we're working on. And the final piece of the jigsaw for me really is something called salutogenesis. Saluto is health, genesis creation, and how we might focus on the factors that bring us a sense of health and well-being, rather than, as we're trained to do in the healthcare, focus on disease. We're all about disease. We're a national disease service. That's the way we're trained. Well, if we started healthcare staff thinking about the factors that bring health and well-being to us as individuals, then we might begin to role model that for our patients. So for me, really, that's the final piece of the jigsaw. It's work of a guy called Antonovsky, who coined the phrase salutogenesis. And his unifying concept was really that we are able to find in our lives a sense of coherence. It's aspirational sometimes. Life does not always make sense. But if we're able to see the arc of our lives and have a sense of coherence about that, that actually brings a fair amount of balance and steadiness to us, which can be very healing, actually.
Yeah. Yes, so I noticed we're coming to the end of the time that we've allotted, and you've packed a lot of content in there. I'm really touched by what you're sharing, and I suppose my question is, how do you get that out there more widely? Are people listening to you? Do you have a platform within the NHS, and then beyond that, obviously, but let's start there. Do you have a platform, or is anyone listening to you? Are you?
I don't really know how to answer that, Maria. I do an awful lot of talking, as you've seen in the last 30 minutes. I share a lot of this within our own hospital, and certainly we are all engaged. This is a community effort to think about how we can practice self-care, use sophrology. We do a lot of sophrology in the hospital. I did a session in the boardroom yesterday lunchtime with a group of people, teaching them about this moment of pause and balance. I have a role in a medical school, and I talk about it there as well. I will talk about it to anyone who will listen. So
that's the way, isn't it? And
yeah.
that's the way I talk about what I do, and I think it applies to what you do. Is how do we make it irresistible?
Exactly. Yeah, and I try and role model it. That's a lot of young leaders say, what's the most important thing? And I think it's walking the talk and talking the walk.
Absolutely. Yeah. Being able for people to actually sort of see the trail that you leave behind you.
Right.
And to learn from it, and to bask in it, Yeah, this has been amazing. I'm just so, honestly, I was so blown away when I met you. I still am. And very grateful for you and others like you who are, taking this stance, looking inside first, because, we cannot heal anything if we're not healing ourselves. We don't have to be perfectly healed, but we have to be in process, don't we?
Oh, I am a work in progress. But
yes, well, aren't we all? Yes. So this has been absolutely wonderful. Is there anything that you want to, anything you want to say in conclusion, or anything you want to sort of put out there that maybe supports people to change the way they're operating or thinking in the mainstream?
Yeah, I think just start close in. We don't all have to move to the ocean or the countryside. Start noticing what's around you, and with gratitude. Even if it's hard to find the thing to be grateful for. A lot of the thinkers that I draw on were either people who lived through the Holocaust or didn't live through the Holocaust but wrote beforehand. I'm thinking of Etty Hillesum. But many of the thinkers did live through the Holocaust. And if they could come up with their amazing insights at that terrible time in history. It's incumbent on us with our challenges in 2025 to look around us and see what we can do and see what we can still be grateful for and what we can bring to our communities.
Yeah, and certainly I think I don't want to leave it unsaid, you know, that you experienced a colleague who took his own life, and the sadness and the, you know, how do you come back from that? And I guess I just want to honour the fact that you took that, you looked inside and tried to at least make some sense for others of what happened to this poor guy. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
My pleasure.